the things that happened in the campaign, calling Mexicans rapists and murderers, blaming a judge who issued a ruling that was hostile to Trump by saying, well, he only did it because he was Mexican. He was endorsed by the KKK and he refused to distance himself from the KKK. These were all inflammatory moves that accomplished a specific political objective, which was to inflame passions, with some people being very pro and some people being anti, as long as everyone was talking about Donald Trump. Donald Trump got to set the agenda, governing by spectacle. And we've seen since he became president as well. Blaming foreigners. Now, obviously, the United States can't blame the United States for interfering in its domestic affairs. What Trump is instead is blaming immigrants. The immigrants are responsible for crime in the country. They're responsible for rape in the country. They're responsible for this and that. When that's actually the exact opposite. Obviously, immigrants commit crimes at a far lower level than native-born Americans do. That doesn't matter. There needs to be a foreigner to blame, and Trump has focused on immigrants. The anti-immigrant theme of the Trump presidency, I think, is absolutely integral to Trump's political project, and therefore will remain, regardless if there's any quote-unquote reform of immigration. He doesn't want reform of immigration. He doesn't want legal immigration. He wants no immigration whatsoever. Or more accurately, he wants to continually be able to blame immigrants and refugees for the ills of society. Again, a populist, rated of the populist playbook. And then fourth, the undermining of institutions. Now, obviously, the United States has not gone to the extent of Venezuela. Of course, it's only been 2 years and not 20. But right off the bat, you can see some hostility towards institutions, towards anything that might be a check or a balance on the power of Donald Trump. So, calling the press the enemy of the people, that's exactly what Maduro has called them in Venezuela as well. Politicizing the judiciary. And the other thing that both the Maduro government does and the Trump government does, which is strange, at least from my perspective as a public servant, when you work in the executive branch of a government, you follow the orders of whoever the boss is, the prime minister or the president. Both President Maduro and President Trump blame their own bureaucracies for poor outcomes. If there are dysfunctional emergency rooms, for example, it's because the Ministry of Health is somehow doing something wrong, even though the Ministry of Health reports to the president. There's a term for that now in populist rhetoric, which is the deep state, and that is also common for every kind of populist project. There's always this blaming, even of the branch that's controlled by the presidency, is somehow suspect. My concern with the United States is if it follows down the path of populist politics that it is embarked on with Trump, that it will end up in a place where it is not able to make decisions as a nation as well. I think we're already seeing some pretty alarming trends in American politics that politicians the parties of both stripes are not able to sufficiently grasp because of the fundamental divisions in that country. Now, in the interest of time, I think I'll skip the United Kingdom, but I do believe that there's an argument to be made to how populist politics are removing the ability of the British people to make decisions over their nation as well. Witness the total paralysis over Brexit and the inability of Britain to talk about anything but Brexit. Now, it's a slightly different situation that there's a populism of the right, an anti-European or Euroscepticism populism that's being now counteracted by a populism of the left. But I will leave that to the question and answer period if you're interested in that. What I do want to jump to is the question about whether populism is potentially good for democracy. Now, I think the arguments in favor of this come from those that would say that populism is certainly illiberal, but it's possible to have democracy that's not liberal. So take one prominent scholar on populism. His name is Cas Mood. He's a Dutch scholar who's written a fabulous book on populism. If anyone wants to go a little bit deeper, I would recommend his book. It's called A Very Brief Introduction to Populism. He argues essentially that populism consists of three elements. The first is an insistence on the division of the nation between the pure people and the elite. Secondly, that the elite is inherently corrupt. In other words, that Those who have economic and political power in the nation are imagined to be in some kind of active coordination with one another to deprive resources and power of the rest of the population. Therefore, they're using their power for their own private interests, and that's corruption. And then secondly, that the people have a common will, that the pure people, the real people of the country, whether in the Trumpian mind it's like white Americans, or whether it's in the Chavista mind it's the urban poor, that they actually have a sort of collective mind and they have a collective set of interests that are different from the accumulated interests of all the individuals in society. So Mood argues, well, in this situation, it's possible for a populist leader to be able to force into the political conversation certain constituencies that are historically marginalized. The second argument is that sometimes elites are actually actively coordinating among themselves in order to maintain tight control over the resources of a nation or the power of a nation. So while those kinds of populists might not be leading to liberal outcomes, because they'll undermine the kinds of institutions that protect human rights, such as the freedom of the press, the independence of the judiciary, the separation of powers, et cetera, that they might at least break open a kind of broken political system, a calcified political system. That has not been what I've observed in practice. That might be possible in theory, and I can see how, when we're thinking about similar problems that we're facing in our society, there might be that temptation to think perhaps populism could be good. Maybe populism of my kind, like of my ideology, if we embrace these very powerful political weapons and we use them in order to advance my party's agenda, it might be worth doing. And I certainly can understand the temptation. Populism is a powerful political weapon. If you can wield it, you can get into power, and you can stay in power forever, possibly. However, those of us who care about democracy and those who care about human rights, I think should be very, very careful about going down the populist road. First, because of the embrace of the differences in our society. We are all societies are divided, but if you start from that as the beginning, the starting point of your argument, that division is real and it's permanent, you're playing into the populists on the other side, because they will also agree that the population is fundamentally divided, and you might never ever be able to bridge that gap. It's extremely rare when a society is divided for one side to totally and absolutely dominate the other, at least without a civil war and the deaths of thousands of people, which I don't think any of us would wish on any of these countries. And so once you subscribe to division, you might be divided forever. The second is that while populists claim to serve the people, in reality, they never do. They serve themselves, they amass power into their own hands, and the people on whose interests they invoke as they're amassing power always get the short end of the stick. In my first year, I was a political science nerd. I was really quite fascinated by the idea that Chavismo had that perhaps we could mobilize the urban poor in a fundamentally different way than representative democracy. There'd be neighborhood councils that would make decisions on budget spending in a neighborhood. And so I would attend many of these. And what I observed was that there was always one person that controlled those kinds of meetings. And it was always the party official. And it was if a neighborhood committee could ever agree on what the funding priorities should be, the money always came from the presidency. And at the end of the day, it was the presidency that decided. It was always top down. Even these supposedly bottom-up structures were always top down. And if you look at what's happened in Venezuela right now, the people that are suffering the most are the urban poor. So after 20 years of having a government who said we only care about that class of Venezuelans and we are willing to completely ignore or actively hurt the rest of the population in order to advance the interests of the urban poor are poorer and more powerless and more subject to human rights abuse now than they were before. I would argue it's the same thing with Trump. Think about where the sort of heartland of his base is. In the Deep South or Appalachia, or the rural white poor are poorer now than when he became president, and they're steadily getting poorer, and they certainly don't have any more voice in the politics of the United States. If anything, they're getting more and more marginalized. That is the logic of populism, because while populists claim to be serving the people, they actually are serving themselves. So let's, in closing, let me just touch briefly on Canada. Now, this is the Canadian International Council, so we focus on international issues, not Canadian. So I won't go too far into analyzing where we are in our own politics, but I'd like to offer a framework by which you can make your own decisions about whether we're at risk of populism in Canada. As I mentioned, it's a powerful political weapon, and so there will be aspirants to office in Canada that will be thinking about using these techniques. So first, populist divide. Can you think of politicians in Canada that argue that not only are we divided, obviously we're divided, all nations are divided, we have English and French, we have regional divisions, we have people that are power and privilege and people that don't have power and privilege. But can you think of politicians that are embracing that division and saying that division is permanent and we've got to help one set of those against the other? That would be the question I would ask. I don't think that that's the case with the three major political parties, but I will make, we're a nonpartisan organization, so I think what I'll do is if I say something bad about a conservative, I'll then say something bad about a liberal to make it, to make it equal. The former Prime Minister of Canada, who I actually served and who I have a tremendous amount of respect for just from having observed him in action, Stephen Harper, I was a civil servant in his cabinet office and so saw him in cabinet meetings, and I know that he governed with rich small Canadians at heart. Whether you think he succeeded or not is a matter of political debate. But since he left office, he's written a book called Right Here, Right Now, where he does actually embrace the idea of the nation of Canada being fundamentally divided. He uses the terms anywheres and somewheres. So the argument is that like, there's sort of a global elite, like maybe you're a software developer and you can work wherever you want from the local Starbucks, whether it's here in Winnipeg or in Tahiti or Paris, and you make money regardless because you've got the skill set of the modern economy and you're from anywhere, versus someone who's deeply rooted in their community, who's somewhere. Now it sounds like a pretty benign way to divide our nation, but the argument is essentially maybe the Conservative Party of today should be mobilizing support among the somewheres against the anywheres. I just think that's a really dangerous way to frame Canadian politics. Anytime that you say there is a division and it's natural and permanent and we should focus on one set against the other, you're starting down a dangerous path. Second, populists governed by spectacle. Now, we have a Prime Minister who's pretty talented in communications as well. And he's often accused of virtue signaling. Think about immigration, for example. So, obviously the government has embraced refugees. So the opposite of what Trump's doing, of demonizing refugees, is this kind of celebration of refugees. And sometimes that can be described as spectacle. We allowed 40,000 Syrians to come into our country in 2015, 2016, compared to 1 million in Germany. So if you're focused on refugee issues, that's not that impressive a record. And when we do allow refugees in, there's also quite a lot of PR around it as well, right? Trudeau goes to Pearson Airport and welcomes the Syrian refugees. And there was that Saudi teenage girl who ran away from her family and hid in an airport in Thailand, and then she was granted refugee status. The foreign minister, Christian Freeman, shows up at Ottawa Airport with like a Canadian flag and embraces her, and the cameras are all there. So there's a little bit of spectacle to the way the Trudeau government governs. Now, I guess what I would say is it's much better to virtue signal than to vice signal, and I would accuse the Trump government of vice signaling. Like the spectacle that they're creating is usually about things that are morally offensive, like saying that the KKK and the Nazis at the Charlottesville who killed that protester were fundamentally good people. Like I think that's far worse than anything that the Trudeau government has done. But still, there is that sort of tendency to govern by spectacle that I think we need to be aware of. Third, blaming foreigners. And specifically claiming that foreigners are secretly controlling what's happening in our country. Now, that certainly happens on the fringes. You can think of like right-wing politicians and those on the far left that make those claims. I think what disturbed me recently, to go back to the Conservatives now, the criticism of the Global Compact on migration. I'm not sure if any of you followed that, but anyone who knows anything about multilateral diplomacy will know that is totally toothless. It's a declaration of good intentions And it's important for diplomats to write those kinds of documents, because if you get 100 countries to agree at least on what they're going to intend to do in their own national legislatures and policies, there's no harm done. But the claim that some conservatives made that somehow we're surrendering our control of immigration to some bureaucrats in New York is not only fundamentally wrong, but it's dangerous, because that's just not true. To say that you as citizens of Canada don't have control over your immigration system is to play into those same kind of tropes that the populists want, to make you feel powerless. So the only way you can regain some kind of quote-unquote control is to elect someone who's going to sweep away all the institutions by which you exercise power right now. Populists want you to feel powerless so that they can get rid of those checks and balances. And I just think that was an unfortunate decision by the Conservatives to describe the Global Compact and migration that way. And then finally, institutions. Now, my view is institutions are quite strong. One thing that's great about a diplomatic career, you go to a place like Venezuela, you come back here, and we're doing okay. But we have to be careful. Democracy is fragile. It was very strong in Venezuela in the 1970s and 80s, and now it's gone. And so we've got to be careful as well. This SNC Lavalin scandal, I think, has shaken a lot of us to our core. Some fundamental principles of the rule of law. I was worried as a former public servant that the public service was starting to get drawn into that with this highly political statement that the outgoing clerk, Michael Warnick, had made. That was already kind of a bit weird. What worried me even more was the reaction of some of the critics of the Trudeau government that said, you see, the public service, they're not independent, they're always on the side of the Liberals. That's the sound of an eroding national institution. To his credit, Michael Warnick resigned. It was a big deal. If you're in bureaucracy, the clerk of the Privy Council is close to God. So the fact that he fell on his sword to protect the public service was a true act of national, true service to the nation. But still, the fact that our judiciary, the independence of our judiciary could be called into question, the fact that our public service could be called into question. There's certainly lots of criticism of the media. I recognize I'm in a building named after the Winnipeg Free Press. I think we should all hold individual news agencies to account, but whenever you start hearing people saying that all journalists, all media, or this really pernicious term, mainstream media, which gets shortened to MSM, that somehow journalists as a whole are trying to deceive us, that is a very dangerous route to go down, because we require an independent media in order for us to be informed as citizens. And I hear way too much criticism of the media as a whole in Canada right now. So I do think we need to be strong. What can we do to protect ourselves? We do exactly the opposite of what the populists do. So if populists divide, then we must remain united. Now, we're never going to agree on everything, and we shouldn't. That wouldn't be democracy if we all had exactly the same policy prescriptions. But I think there is a way that we can advance whatever opinions we have in an honest and respectful and open dialogue with those that disagree with us. So when we enter in the debate about what we should be doing over healthcare or immigration or our relationship with the United States or whatever, we should do it as Canadians, trying to reach out to other Canadians that might have different ideas. The second, if populists govern by spectacle, we have the ability as citizens, as newsreaders, not to join in the spectacle. So if we receive something in our Facebook feed or our Twitter feed that makes us furious, what I'd ask you is just wait a few seconds, look at the source, figure out where it's coming from. Is it coming from a journalist that you know? Is it coming from a news agency that you know? Does it sound credible? Think about that before you share it, because we are all publishers of media in our own right now. We are all responsible for the news that everyone else is receiving. And where we used to have editorial boards that would do that for all of society, determining what was newsworthy and what was not, what was true, what was not, that's now been delegated to all of us. And so we have a responsibility that comes with us in the way that we consume, in the way that we share news, to not join in the spectacle and not put that populist politician front and center, whether it's to love him or to hate him. Third, blaming foreigners. I mean, I hope I suppose, leading a foreign policy think tank. I would hope no one in this audience falls into that kind of trap of blaming foreigners, but we can go farther. We can actually actively learn about the nature of international politics and international relations. We can become more informed citizens, and we can engage in the debate about Canada's foreign policy. And that, I think, is where the CIC comes in. To repeat the plug from earlier, this is an amazing opportunity for you as people of Winnipeg to join in that regular debate through the events that happen here every month, to be exposed to international experts, to learn about what's happening in the world, and to share your perspective. And then fourth, when it comes to institutions, we're not just passive observers of what's happening to our institutions. Our institutions are there for us. And therefore, I think all of us as citizens have a potential role to play in strengthening our institutions. Some of these are old institutions. Parliaments date from the 13th century, media from God knows when, but hundreds of years ago. The way that the institutions look right now probably don't fit for the digital age. They need to change. But instead of throwing them out or denouncing them, let's work with them. So obviously something that all citizens can do is vote. I would hope everyone in this room votes. Please do it while you can. But you can go beyond voting. If someone that you know is running for office, volunteer for them. If there's an NGO or a community cause that you believe in, volunteer for that. Express your citizenship not just in the way that you react to the news, but in the actions that you take in your community and your nation. I'm going to end up with a quote from de Tocqueville, this French observer of the United States in the 1830s. That seems like a really different time from what we're dealing with right now in the 2010s. But it was a time when there were many, many more voices entering into the political system, and it was a very tumultuous time, very divided time, very unstable time in both Europe and North America. Obviously, we had a major rebellion in 1837. As you may remember, both in Toronto and Montreal, there was a fair amount of violence at that time, and that was common everywhere. It's because there had recently been an increase in the franchise, so more and more people were voting. Now, it's because of technology, more and more people are informed about what's happening and are sharing their opinions. And these are unsettling times. What Tocqueville pointed to, the success of the United States in that time is what he called the art of living together. His argument was that Americans have this kind of tendency to form like civil society, I guess we call them NGOs now, that they would band together in their communities outside of government to try and solve problems, whether it was about poverty or about violence or about education. And it was that kind of connective tissue that they were able to create outside of the realm of government that helped them learn how to live together, even as their differences seem to become more and more stark. And I think that might be the way of looking at the challenge that we face right now as we're looking at the threat of populism and all of the stress that our societies are under, that we need to learn the art of living together in the digital age. So I hope that a platform like the CIC can be a place that we can learn the art of living together, to learn how to debate, to learn how to argue with one another, to learn how to read the news and how to share the news. It doesn't depend just on the CIC. There's many other ways to do it, but I'd like to end with a call for us all to focus on the art of living together so that we can build a form of democracy that makes sense of the digital age and that empowers citizens, unlike the false promise of populism. Thank you.
Questions. Yeah, we've got 15 minutes. And there's a few questions came in on the web that
Okay.
wanted to.
Why don't I give you this and you can read those? Sure, I will.
Or we can share.
That was giving us the feedback. Okay. So as you're thinking about questions to pose, I'm also talking to an internet audience. So we'll start with one question from the internet to the audience.
Sure. And we did have a few questions come in off the internet. The first one, what was going back to Venezuela now, what was the catalytic agent for the worse that economically ruined Venezuela?
So Venezuela, the Venezuelan crisis has had a long history. It's at least 5 years in the making. I mentioned the increase in the price of oil, which was an external shock. If I had to point to internally, I would say the decision to fix the exchange rate, it seems like totally random macroeconomic theory. But in 2003, Chavez decided that the exchange rate of bolivars to hard currency, US or whatever, would remain fixed. And immediately a black market started where there was a different price in the black market. So you could always go to the exchange, the official exchange, get a bunch of bolivars, or take your bolivars, get some dollars, and then go into the black market and get way more bolivars, and then go back into the official exchange and get way more. You could just do this over and over and over again. And eventually that gap went from just like a few cents to 1,000-fold. By the time I left, the official price was, I think, 10 bolivars to the dollar, and the unofficial price was 10,000. So you imagine how much money you can make. And with the people making money like that, it essentially just destroyed the ability of the economy. Like, prices just didn't mean anything, and that's where hyperinflation set in. I'll take one. Yes, in purple?
So good afternoon. I am a visiting scholar and author, and I worked in all the countries where you operate. I worked in Afghanistan, I worked in Iraq, I worked in Venezuela. And it appears that your world and the world as we see it outside of the Western realm, they somehow do not coincide. It is very interesting that we talk about populism, but what is it that you are offering here? I mean, basically, this is the typical fundamentalist talk about the country that you help to destabilize. Let me ask you something. What are you really doing?
You mean me personally?
Yes, you as
or me as the West?
Of Canada, yes, the West,
the West,
embassies,
okay.
Because we all very well know what you are doing in Syria in the past, how you were creating dissent, how you created opposition in Venezuela. I mean, you have blood on your hands. The people who are now suffering in Venezuela are not suffering because of some kind of a divisive populism. It is because you implanted so-called opposition. And what about Afghanistan, this wonderful place that you occupied? I mean, it has the lowest human life expectancy in Asia, according to UNDP. Shortest life expectancy according to the World Health Organization. Is this your way really how you see the world, how you operate? What is CIC? Is it more money for you to try to destabilize the countries further? I don't understand. And you stand here and you are talking about some details, something that is absolutely not important. Well, for anybody who ever worked in Venezuela knows how the crisis was created. It was absolutely clearly created by the West, by your embassies, not of course only Canadian embassy, US embassy, European embassies, and so on. And you rely on the elites in Venezuela, which are bleeding the country to the ground. Also the press. You talk about the press. Venezuelan press is the freest press in the world. They basically Chavez allowed any criticism. When I came first time after the revolution to Caracas, journalists were crying on my shoulder that they are actually supporting Chavez, but they would be fired if they would write anything supportive of him. Why? Because the press is fully in the hands of the right wing in Venezuela, and it is until now. And you call it violation of press freedoms. I don't understand really what are you talking about, but this is not the world that I know, and it's not the world that most of the people know.
Thank you. I respect your opinion. I'd like to delve a little bit just to understand your perspective, because it's so radically different from what I observed from the thousands of Venezuelans I talked to, for example. What brought you to those countries? What was the professional capacity in which you were working at?
I'm a scholar, I'm a writer, filmmaker, investigative journalist.
And what was the period?
15 books behind my belt in 40 languages.
What was the period that you were in Venezuela?
I was in Venezuela about 8 times since the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And the last period?
1 year.
1 year. And
And I work, of course, all over Latin America. I came here from Bolivia, right now in Peru, so it's not like...
do we have any Venezuelans in the audience today?
Yes.
Could I ask for your opinions about Venezuela? I mean, I'm a Canadian. I assume you're a Canadian citizen as well.
I'm
So,
not.
what's your citizenship?
I have a U.S. citizenship.
Okay, so we've got an American and a Canadian. Can we listen to the views of some of the Venezuelans in the audience, please? Can you share your perspective of what's happening in your country, so that it's not really up to me?
You want me to talk? I'm appalled of what he's saying right now. I mean, my family is there, and they are starving. There's no water, no electricity. This is not done for the United States or the Canadians or whatever people likes to blame others. This is a bad administration of what that supposed called government has done to our people. The rate of poverty that we had before Chavez came, let's put it was 10%, and what he did is he equaled all of us to poverty. That's what he did. He put us down to misery. And I can't believe that you think that what is happening in there is okay.
Well, 68%
It's
of the population
let me finish, please, because you've been talking for 2 minutes and a half. I think I have the right
Sure.
to talk.
Yes.
I think it's very easy to feel being a socialist and communist when you are in a country that you can go to the grocery store and buy whatever you want,
Yeah.
that you can drive and put the gas whenever you want, that you receive a payroll based on what your efforts, how much you have studied, how much your jobs are. When you're there, you go to the grocery store and there's just one kind of flour, one kind of milk, one type, and if you find everybody has to be the same, and no one is allowed to buy more than once a week, because you have an ID that they will check on you, and if you came on Monday, you got your milk, well, that's your milk for the week, people.
Yeah.
Then you have to figure it out what else. I mean, I don't know what to say.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to, I'll give you a chance to respond. I think it's actually important. We should be modeling an open and respectful democratic debate here. There are very different ways of perceiving things. I have the perspective that I've developed through my time in Venezuela, and I do think that we have the obligation to honor the voices of people that are from the country and that have actually experienced that. But of course, everyone has a different perspective. I just want to make sure that we share our perspectives in a way that are respectful, and then try to educate those of us that are listening, the third parties to this debate. So on that note, please, back to you, sir, in the purple.
No, I just wanted to say that's why you are here and we are defending Caracas. Venezuela has 68% of the people who support Maduro, and another 20% are probably extreme left.
Could you please
Much
repeat
more
that
left.
again?
Yes, of course.
You said that 68% was
68% is supporting.
on Venezuela?
Yes, of course.
I don't know what Venezuela you're going. I can tell you right now.
But I know which Venezuela you are
Well,
talking about.
I am with the people that they are
Are you
dying
Venezuelan too?
of hungriness. There is actually
And
a
why are they
company
dying
that's
from
called Data
hunger?
Analysis, that is the one that it does all the
Be
percentage.
specific, yeah.
Right now, 84% of all Venezuela are against Maduro and the dictatorship that is going
Well,
on.
where are your numbers
And-
from?
and-
Where do you get your numbers?
Please,
It
please,
was just
don't
yesterday.
cut that
It
out.
just
It's a
happened
very
yesterday.
And you
critical
want
point.
a global mail?
I want to make
it
sure
was
to give
from-
some
it was
chance to
online. You
other
can-
voices as well.
You can Google Data Analysis. That's actually a reliable company that calls on by phone and asks questions to every single citizen, and that's how they make their numbers.
Did you hear
Thank
about
you.
the cool
No, I think
shit
we'd like to move on to some other voices to make sure that
Yeah.
we give,
Sorry.
the other lady here, please.
Thank you so much. So I'm actually also Venezuelan, and I really appreciate the analysis you did. You put very clear the strategy of division, and I think we should get into that again. And I appreciate so much that you are wanting to provide a space here for all of us to share the knowledge that we have. And in that sense, I appreciate so much that we keep that in mind and we don't try to divide. And it's very accurate, actually, the analysis you did. It's true that there have been one section of the country that was suffering, and that actually that section of the country was appealed by that discourse and that narrative, and that narrative that Chavez President Chavez used was actually very divisive, and we are suffering from that right now. And actually, there is also, I also want to let know here, I have heard from some groups that actually are not from Venezuela, and that have been trying to advance their opinions on what's going on there. And with great sadness, I have seen they are trying to exploit that there is a white elite fighting a color elite, which is actually the farthest thing that could happen in Venezuela, because even when we have any skin color, if you are Venezuelan, you know very well that you are a Métis, that you are a mix of European, African,
Peruvian.
Indian, Native American people. So we are very aware if you are a Venezuelan and you actually wear that with pride. You are a mix of all these cultures, and we embrace them all. So I really would like to clarify this.
Could you bring your
Yes, I
point
really
that
want to
question?
clarify this, because actually there are certain groups that are advancing opinions about what is going on in Venezuela with some ignorance of what is really the culture in Venezuela. And I want to say to the audience, I really appreciate your analysis because it's very accurate, and open your minds to that analysis and don't let yourself be guided by divisive opinions of certain groups.
Thank you for that comment. I do want to invite criticism of my comments. I'm very grateful to have support, but I think we have a better debate as Canadians if we're open with our differences of opinion. So I'll ask the gentleman with the white beard.
Right here?
Yeah.
Gentleman with the white hair. And I'm a bit of a gray beard, I guess. But I was taking some notes, and the young ladies who were just talking, I think probably were not born since the Chavez situation in, what, 1999 was it? But you mentioned a figure that I wrote down, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the name correctly, but I'd like some clarification, because I got written down that this happened in the 80s, and I have Caracaso, and did you say that 300,000 people were killed?
300 to 2,000. The low end estimate is 300 and the high end estimate is
300, so not
2,000.
300,000.
No.
Under what auspices did those killings happen? I mean, I hear on the one hand, I hear that this was a time of bounty and democracy, and yet there was significant social discord prior to Chavez.
Yes, it sure was. If you'll permit me, my Venezuelan friends, I'll try to recap. The Caracaso, it's a little, not very well placed to describe such a traumatic event in the life of Venezuelans, even if it was only thousands and not hundreds of thousands that were killed. My understanding of what happened, it was 1989, so it's 7 years after the economic crisis of 1982, so after a period of really difficult times for Venezuela. There had been a succession of different governments, and then in February 1989, Venezuelans elected a social democratic government that was promising more redistribution of incomes. When that government took office and was briefed on the severity of the economic situation, they decided quite suddenly to adopt quite stringent measures that we would now call austerity. And as those were being rolled out, they provoked a sudden flow of anger from the population. The specific trigger was an increase in gas, which made public transportation much more expensive. And so at 6 in the morning in this one very distant barrio, this distant shanty town, where people were relying on public transportation to travel 2 hours to get downtown to do their jobs,